If you look at what just happened between Washington and Ottawa in the last 48 hours, it doesn't look like diplomacy. It doesn't look like posturing. It looks like a chess move that just put the king in check. For decades, the Arctic was a frozen afterthought, a vast, empty, white nothing that showed up on maps but never showed up in strategy meetings. Satellites passed over it. Submarines passed under it. Nobody fought over it. That just changed. Donald Trump thought the tariff war was over. He thought Mark Carney had fired his biggest shot with the energy redirect and the Asian pivot. He thought the worst was behind him. He thought if he held firm through the summer, Canada would buckle by fall. He thought wrong. Because Mark Carney didn't just have one card left, he had the card. The one nobody in Washington even knew was in the deck. And he just played it in a way that made Beijing smile, made Brussels gasp, and made the Pentagon pick up the phone at 2 a.m. Trump isn't scrambling anymore. He's spiraling, his cabinet is fractured, his generals are furious, and the thing nobody in the Situation Room wants to say out loud is now echoing through every hallway in the West Wing. Canada just seized control of the most strategically valuable territory on Earth, and America wasn't even watching. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what Carney just did, why the White House had zero contingency for it, and why the next 60 days could redraw the map of global power in ways we haven't seen since the fall of the Berlin Wall. So, let's rewind the clock. Here is exactly what happened. It started on a Thursday, 9 days after Carney's Calgary energy announcement sent oil markets into a frenzy. The tariff war was grinding on. Gas prices were climbing. Auto plants were still sputtering. Congress was drafting letters. Cable news was running split screens of empty factory floors and fuel price tickers. Everyone was watching the pipelines. Everyone was watching the border. Nobody was watching the Arctic. On Friday morning, the Canadian Department of National Defense issued a press release. It was buried. 12 paragraphs, bureaucratic language, something about enhanced sovereignty operations in the Canadian Arctic archipelago. Most outlets ignored it. Reuters ran 4 sentences, CNN didn't mention it at all. But buried in paragraph 9 was a single line that, when it finally got noticed, detonated like a depth charge across every foreign ministry on the planet. Canada was formally activating the Northern Sovereignty Infrastructure Act, another law Carney's government had quietly passed, this one just 6 weeks earlier. Under this act, Canada was asserting full regulatory and military control over the Northwest Passage. Every vessel, military or commercial, from any nation would now require Canadian authorization, Canadian piloting, and Canadian environmental clearance to transit. No exceptions. No grandfathering, effective immediately. The room didn't go silent this time. The room exploded. Let me show you the receipts. Receipt number 1, the shipping shockwave. You need to understand what the Northwest Passage is and why it matters. As the Arctic melts, and it is melting faster than any model predicted, the Northwest Passage is becoming a navigable commercial route. A cargo ship going from Shanghai to Rotterdam through the Suez Canal travels 12,000 nautical miles. Through the Northwest Passage, it's 7,900. That's a 34% reduction in distance. Weeks off transit time, billions in fuel savings, trillions in long-term economic value. Every major shipping company on Earth, Maersk, COSCO, MSC, has been quietly studying this route for a decade. They've been running ice-class vessel trials. They've been lobbying for access, and the single biggest question hanging over all of it was who controls the passage. The United States has maintained for 50 years that the Northwest Passage is an international strait. Open waters. Free transit, number single nation gets to play gatekeeper. Canada has always disagreed. They've always claimed it as internal waters, sovereign territory, but they never enforced it. They never had the infrastructure, the naval presence, or the political will. Carney just provided all three. In a single week, he deployed 2 Arctic patrol vessels to Lancaster Sound, activated the new deepwater port at Nanisivik that had been sitting half-finished for years, and signed an emergency contract with a Finnish shipbuilder for 3 ice-capable patrol cutters to be delivered within 18 months. He didn't ask Washington's opinion. He didn't consult NATO. He didn't float a trial balloon. He just did it. And the legal framework he used was airtight. His team had spent months building the case, unclawed provisions, environmental jurisdiction precedents. Indigenous sovereignty agreements with Inuit communities that gave the whole thing a human rights dimension no Western court would touch. Shipping futures contracts went haywire. Lloyd's of London issued a bulletin to every insurer in its network. Arctic transit risk profiles were being reassessed effective immediately. The cost of insuring a cargo vessel through the Northwest Passage without Canadian authorization just became, and I quote, commercially prohibitive. He made it economically impossible to use without his permission. Receipt number 2, the mineral lockdown. Now, here's where it gets devastating. While the shipping world was reeling, something else was happening simultaneously. Canada's Minister of Natural Resources held a closed-door briefing with ambassadors from the EU, Japan, South Korea, and Germany. The briefing was about critical minerals. You have to understand the mineral map to understand why this matters. The Canadian Arctic, specifically the territories of Nunavut and the Northwest Territories, sits on top of one of the largest untapped deposits of rare earth elements on the planet. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, tungsten. The exact minerals that every electric vehicle battery, every fighter jet, every semiconductor, every piece of advanced military hardware requires. Right now, China controls 70% of global rare earth processing. The United States has been desperately trying to diversify its supply chain. The Pentagon has called critical mineral dependence on China a Tier 1 national security vulnerability. And the single most promising alternative source, the one that shows up in every DoD briefing, every Department of Energy white paper, every congressional testimony on supply chain resilience, is Canada. Carney just wrapped those minerals inside the same sovereignty framework as the Northwest Passage. Any extraction, any export, any joint venture involving Arctic critical minerals will now go through a new federal review board with the authority to block deals on national interest grounds. And the first deal he blocked? A $2.3 billion mining partnership between a Canadian exploration company and an American defense contractor. The reason given? Insufficient alignment with Canadian strategic priorities. That's diplomatic language. Translated into English, it means, you don't get our minerals while you're taxing our cars. The Pentagon's reaction was immediate and volcanic. A leaked internal memo from the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition described the mineral lockdown as, and I'm reading directly, a more immediate threat to U.S. defense readiness than any action taken by a near-peer adversary in the last 5 years. They weren't talking about China. They weren't talking about Russia. They were talking about Canada, America's closest ally, the country that shares the longest undefended border on Earth, the country that has fought beside the United States in every major conflict since World War I. That country just became, in the Pentagon's own words, a threat to defense readiness. Let that sink in. Receipt number 3, the Beijing phone call. This is the one that should keep every American strategist awake for the next decade. On Saturday, 36 hours after the Arctic announcement, Mark Carney had a phone call with Xi Jinping. The readout from Ottawa was brief. 2 sentences, the Prime Minister and President Xi discussed areas of mutual interest in Arctic development and sustainable resource management. Both leaders agreed to continue the dialogue. 2 sentences, 29 words, and every single one of them was a grenade. Because here is what that phone call really was. Carney was showing Washington that he has options. That if the United States wants to treat Canada like an adversary, Canada can find other friends. Friends with very deep pockets. Friends who would love nothing more than a foothold in the Arctic. Friends who have been trying to get exactly that foothold for 15 years and have been blocked every time by the U.S.-Canada partnership. Carney isn't going to sell the Arctic to China. He's too smart for that. He knows the politics, he knows the optics, but he doesn't have to actually do it. He just has to make Washington believe he might. And that phone call, those 2 carefully crafted sentences, accomplished exactly that. Within an hour, the National Security Advisor was on a plane to Ottawa, not invited, not scheduled. He just showed up, and Carney, in a move that was either brilliant or brutal or both, made him wait. 3 hours. In a reception room with coffee and a mounted portrait of Queen Elizabeth. The message was unmistakable. You don't get to bully us and then show up demanding answers. You get to sit and wait and think about what you've done. So let's talk about what's really happening inside the White House right now. Because the leaks aren't just extraordinary anymore. They're torrential. Someone, and possibly multiple someones, inside the West Wing has decided that the only way to stop this president from driving the country off a cliff is to let the public see the steering wheel. We are hearing from 4 separate sources that the Joint Chiefs of Staff requested an emergency briefing with the president on Arctic defense posture. Trump reportedly declined the briefing, said he was not worried about ice. His exact words, according to 2 people in the room, "We have Alaska. Alaska is bigger." Tell Carney to enjoy his igloos. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs reportedly stared at the table for a full 10 seconds before responding. What he said has not been leaked, but he was seen leaving the West Wing 40 minutes later, and a source who saw him described his expression as someone who just watched a building collapse. The Secretary of State has been conducting what multiple officials describe as shadow diplomacy, back-channel calls to Ottawa that the president hasn't authorized, quiet conversations with NATO allies about containment, not of Russia, not of China, of the trade war's damage to the alliance. The Commerce Department has produced a new analysis. If the Arctic mineral lockdown holds and the energy redirect continues simultaneously, the combined impact on U.S. GDP over 24 months would be between 1.2 and 1.8 percentage points. That doesn't sound like a lot. It's a recession. A guaranteed, mathematical, unavoidable recession. Centered in the industrial Midwest, centered in the states Trump needs to win. And here's the detail that should terrify every strategist in Washington. Carney timed this perfectly. The U.S. midterm election cycle is beginning. Campaign money is starting to flow. Candidates are starting to file. And every Republican running in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ohio, and Pennsylvania just woke up to a nightmare scenario, defending a trade war that is visibly, measurably destroying their constituents' livelihoods. 3 Republican senators have already broken ranks publicly. A 4th is drafting legislation to override the president's tariff authority. The cracks aren't forming anymore. The cracks are open. And Carney is pouring water into every single one of them. Now let's talk about Carney's endgame, because he has one, and it's not what you think. Carney doesn't want to destroy the U.S.-Canada relationship. He's not anti-American. He spent years living in the United States. His children were born there. He understands America in a way that most foreign leaders don't. And that's exactly what makes him so dangerous. He doesn't want to win the trade war. He wants to make the trade war so painful, so expensive, so politically catastrophic for Donald Trump that anyone in the American system is forced to end it. He's not fighting Trump. He's fighting through Trump. He's using the pain to activate the antibodies in America's own system. Congress, the courts, corporate America, the governors, the voters. He's betting that America's institutions are stronger than America's president. And so far, the bet is paying off. The CEO letter has now grown to 23 signatories. Boeing has joined. Caterpillar has joined. JP Morgan has joined. The letter's second draft doesn't just call for a tariff pause anymore. It calls for a complete reset of North American trade policy, and pointedly, the removal of trade authority from the executive branch. That's not a policy request. That's a constitutional challenge. Corporate America isn't just going around the president anymore. They're trying to strip his power. And Carney, from his quiet office in Ottawa, is watching it happen with the calm patience of a man who spent his career waiting for markets to correct themselves. So why should you care? Let me be blunt. If you live in the United States, this is no longer a trade story. It's a security story. It's a story about whether the country you live in can still function when its leader is at war with its closest ally, its own corporations, its own military advisors, and its own economic interests, all at the same time. If the Arctic lockdown holds, the U.S. defense industry faces a critical mineral shortage within 18 months. The F-35 program alone requires 920 pounds of rare earth elements per aircraft. Where do you think those come from? If the energy redirect accelerates, heating costs in the northern United States this winter could double. Not increase, double. We're talking about families in Vermont, in Maine, in Minnesota, choosing between heating their homes and buying groceries. If the shipping insurance crisis expands, the cost of every product that moves through Pacific trade routes goes up. That's electronics. That's clothing. That's food. That's everything on the shelves of every Walmart and Target and Costco in America. And if the political fracture deepens, if Congress moves to strip trade authority, if the courts get involved, if governors start refusing to enforce federal tariff orders, you're not looking at a policy dispute anymore. You're looking at a constitutional crisis triggered not by an enemy, but by a neighbor who simply decided to stop being taken for granted. But beyond America, beyond Canada, there's something even larger happening here. We are watching the birth of a new kind of power. Not military power in the traditional sense. Resource sovereignty. The idea that a nation's greatest leverage isn't its army or its GDP. It's what's in its ground and who gets access to it. Carney understood this before anyone else. He understood that in a world of energy transition, of electric vehicles, of AI-driven manufacturing, of Arctic melting, the countries that control the raw inputs, the lithium, the cobalt, the nickel, the shipping lanes, the pipeline routes, those countries don't need aircraft carriers, they don't need nuclear arsenals. They need patience and a willingness to say no. Canada just said no. And the world is rearranging itself around that single syllable. So where does this end? I see three paths forward. Path 1, the negotiated climb down. Someone in Trump's circle, possibly the Secretary of State, possibly a coalition of Republican senators, engineers a quiet summit. Carney and Trump meet, probably in a neutral location, probably with no cameras. A framework gets drawn up. Tariffs phased out over 12 months. Arctic regulations softened to allow U.S. defense contractors preferential access. Energy flows normalized. Both sides claim victory. The press moves on. But the damage is done. The Asian LNG deals don't unwind. The Arctic infrastructure doesn't get demolished. The precedent that Canada can and will use resource sovereignty as a weapon, that precedent is permanent. The relationship survives, but it's never the same. Path 2, the fracture. Trump doubles down. He invokes emergency powers to restrict Canadian financial assets in the U.S. Carney retaliates by fully activating the mineral lockdown and opening formal Arctic development negotiations with China and the EU simultaneously. NATO fractures along economic lines. The Arctic becomes a contested zone with Canadian, American, Russian, and Chinese interests all colliding. The Western alliance doesn't just weaken, it splits into competing resource blocks. The post-World War II order, the one that kept the peace for 80 years, ends. Not with a war, with a tariff. Path 3, the transformation, and this is the one I keep coming back to. This is the one that scares me and excites me in equal measure. What if this is the moment that forces a fundamental rethinking of how nations relate to each other? What if Carney's move isn't just about Canada and the United States? What if it's the first move in a global restructuring, where resource-rich nations, Canada, Australia, Brazil, Norway, Indonesia, demand a new seat at the table? Where the old hierarchy, where military superpowers dictated terms and everyone else fell in line, gives way to something more distributed, more balanced, more volatile, but ultimately more honest about where real power comes from. Carney might not be thinking that big. He might just be trying to survive a trade war. But the forces he's unleashed, the precedents he's setting, the alliances he's reshaping, those forces don't stop when the tariffs stop. They have their own momentum now. And nobody, not Carney, not Trump, not anyone, fully controls where they go. Here is what I know for certain. The old world, the one where America could treat its neighbors like subsidiaries, where Canada would absorb every insult and keep shipping oil and minerals and car parts, with a polite smile, that world is dead. It didn't die slowly, it was killed, in a week, by a man who thought he could bully a country that supplies his nation's energy, defends his nation's northern border, and sits on top of the resources his nation's future depends on. And by another man, quieter, colder, more calculating, who waited for exactly the right moment to show the world what happens when you push a polite country past its breaking point. The polite country stops being polite and starts being strategic. Do you think Carney has gone too far? Do you think the Arctic play is genius or recklessness? Is Trump capable of finding an off-ramp, or is he constitutionally incapable of admitting he miscalculated? Drop your take in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to see what happens when the defense contractors start reporting supply chain disruptions, because they will, and when the first heating bills hit mailboxes this fall, because they will, and it will be ugly, make sure you're subscribed. Hit the bell. Share this with someone who still thinks this is just about cars and lumber. It was never about cars and lumber. It was about who controls the top of the world. And right now, the answer to that question is a former central banker from Ottawa who speaks in complete sentences and doesn't blink. The old map is burning. The new one is being drawn in real time. And the hand holding the pen isn't the one anyone expected.